I want to share a passage with you from Søren Kierkegaard's Either Or, Volume 2. And yes, there is a Volume 2, thankfully. There's so much great work of his. But this one over here is on page 213 of this book. And it's a passage that has sat with me in ways that many passages have not before. So it's definitely something I want to ponder, to explore with you. And while doing so, I really want you to keep this topic in mind. And it's the topic or word of despair. It is on beautiful terms despair is offered to you, and yet there are more beautiful terms. Imagine a young man, as talented as you are. Let him love a girl, love her as dearly as himself. Let him once ponder in a quiet hour upon what it is he has constructed his life, and upon what she can construct hers. Love they have in common, and yet he will feel that there are differences. She possesses, perhaps, the gift of beauty, but this has no importance for him, and after all, it is so fragile. She has, perhaps, the joyful temper of youth, but that joy has no great significance for him. But he possesses the power of the mind and feels the might of it. He desires to love her in truth, and it never occurs to him to attribute this power to her. And her meek soul does not demand it, and yet there is a difference, and he will feel that this must be done away if he is to love her in truth. Then he will let his soul sink into despair. It is not for his own sake he despairs, but for hers, and yet it is for his own sake too, for he loves her as dearly as himself. You see, the beauty or despair of this passage is that it could be understood, heard, thought of in so many different ways. It traces back our steps into contemplating what it is that we are and what despair in itself really consists of. When navigating much of Kierkegaard's other works, such as in Sickness unto Death, he defines despair as that which is disconnected from the self. For Kierkegaard, the self is a synthesis of opposites, be it good or bad, life and death, either or. It's the landscape by which we understand these polarities and how we define limitations of both ourselves and the world. But he also recognizes that there's a deeper, a more spiritual meaning involved in the process of the self. That the self is estranged when it is not connected to this divine intervention. Of course, as a theologian as well, he points towards God, especially in the Christian sense, but we don't have to include the Christian element into this category for us to understand the contemplations of God and its relationship to the self. It is simply just tackling that there is a deeper meaning, a more spiritual meaning that lays in our psyche, if you'd like to call it, whereby the self understands that there's a separation between itself and the grounds by which it has been built on. It's a yearning to understand its anxieties for its freedom. As one of his famous quotes is, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom itself." But I'm not here to lecture you or give you a whole educational background on Kierkegaard. There's so many resources there for your learnings. But I instead want to dig into the personal note of despair, of what it means, especially in this context. Let's look at this first line once again. It is on beautiful terms despair is offered to you, and yet there are more beautiful terms. You see the polarity that he brings together and synthesizes into this cohesive idea of self, the beauty and the despair. But this also highlights that despair is part of the very process of becoming oneself. This is also what he refers to in the context of despair in general in many of his other works. But there's a depth here, there's a palpability to the concept of despair, especially when referencing love. It's a very powerful and unique way to dance between this polarity of beauty and of despair by highlighting that this is an essential component of what it means to live in beauty, but that there is something greater than even that, which is that there are more beautiful terms, as he precisely says. We don't need the religious presuppositions to understand this process rationally, but it is important to understand that there's a deeper layer of meaning, a functional meaning involved to our relationship to ourself and to the abstract, whatever that may be for yourself. In this case, with love, something that's so deep, it's irresistible to contemplate in any other ways than despair for Kierkegaard. Even when looking into our own lives, how is it that we conceptualize love? As a polar opposite of pain, possibly. But many will argue that pain is just the absence of love. What does it mean to you? What comes to mind when you hear the word despair in reference to love? Possibly a heartbreak? Possibly the lack of love that you think you might experience in the future? There's so many unknown variables that are involved in this process of despair. And it's interesting because when contemplating these things, it's so human of us to look at its polar opposite, to strive in the opposite direction of despair. And to Kierkegaard, that would be faith specifically. So for faith to be in that direction, it is a hopefulness. A despair is almost, it reminds me of that strangeness that Camus talks about in Myth of Sisyphus. That there is that strangeness to our relationship with the world, where we seek meaning where there is none. That there is something strange even about ourselves in the process when we're disenchanted from who and rather what we are. What is that despair? When we feel lonely, when we feel hurt, what is it that we're feeling? Is it the absence of hope in the future that we will feel such a way? Or is it a loss in the moment, detachment from who we are right here, right now? These are things that Kierkegaard forces us to think about precisely with this quote, especially in something that humans experience so naturally with the connection of another human being. If we read, love, they have in common, and yet he will feel that there are differences. What do you think those differences are? Is it his relationship to love? What relationships do you have with the world around you that informs how you see despair? Are you hopeful about the world, or are you pessimistic? Again, we fall back into these polarities, and despair just slowly creeps into the cracks. It's a very odd phenomenon, despair, particularly in this context, where we are detached from who and what we are, or rather our best self, as many have put it. But on a more philosophical point of view, we need to explore definitionally despair and its varying elements in our own lives. For example, despair could be something, just a form of negativity, for example. Despair could be a upset, a disdain for something that opposes your worldview. Despair could be feeling inundated with things that are outside of your control but affect you so deeply and you just don't know what to do about it. But Kierkegaard reminds us that, fortunately or unfortunately, this is part of the process of understanding ourselves and to experiencing something more beautiful. That love that not only we have for others, as he so beautifully mentioned, this is, again, back in the 1800s, that the beauty, that the youthfulness, the power of the mind, the truth in and of it all, isn't necessarily what he's desiring. He's actually looking for the despair in the process. It actually very briefly reminds me of this example. It was an experiment that someone did where they felt hopeless in looking for jobs, and I think it was her goal to actually get rejected 100 times. I remember hearing about this. I'm not sure if you have more insight, if this was an article or a video or whatnot, but essentially that someone looked out to be rejected in the process of looking for jobs because they felt so hopeless, and that reframed their perspective of their idea of what it meant to feel rejection. And this is kind of the flipping on its head too, where we're looking for despair in the process. We're looking for that love to devour us whole so that we can maybe see ourselves on the other side of it. And what does that mean to us? How does that really feel? Can we feel something pleasant among despair? Is Kierkegaard here trying to merge two completely opposing concepts? Moreover, we just want to see more of ourselves in the things that we attach ourselves to. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be known, and that's completely normal. That is okay. Anything that detaches us from this is often what we experience as despair. This is how we recognize it in the real world. When we see despair as not getting the jobs we want, the people we want around us, lining up from what we tell ourselves we are from what we actually do in our day-to-day. It's a very intriguing phenomenon, and I find it beautiful, for lack of a better term. Despair is that concept that Kierkegaard really pressed his finger on and said, don't shy away from it. Look towards it, knowing it is the pathway of faith. It is almost that this suffering, that this despair is an elementary component to our understanding of ourselves and of the world, and that's completely okay. That when we look for that love in ourselves and the world, it is going to be an instrument of despair. But it's okay because there is that thing that is more beautiful that comes from that. That is worth it. Endows a meaning upon this process. And I find that these are simply words I love to share. And I want you to fill in the blanks of what your personal experiences has been with such a process and transmuting that despair into love, into pure, beautiful love for both yourself, others, and the world. It's an interesting one nonetheless, and something I deeply want to share with you. So if you're still here, thank you so much for listening. I deeply appreciate it, and I highly recommend reading more Kierkegaard. Remember to be human, and thank you so much.